Thank you, Patricia, and thank you so much, Malaprops, for letting us come tonight. I'm so excited to be here with Terry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks to everybody out there in TV land too. This feels like, you know, Mr. Bill and Bozo from the good old days on Channel 13. If you're watching from home, send in your questions, right? And we're going to have a great time.
We sure are. So Terry and I are press mates, I guess you would call it. We share a publisher, or maybe we're like authors-in-law. Is that what you call it?
I'm glad she defined that.
Yeah. And Terry slipped me an advanced copy of the Sky Club a few months ago, and I couldn't put it down. I loved it. So I was delighted when he invited me to come and be his conversation partner. And I'm looking forward to this talk. So, I mean, Terry, tell us what the book is about.
There you go. This is a book about two big things that I think go together. They came together in writing the book. The first thing is I've long wanted to write a novel about that fateful day, November the 20th, 1930. Does anybody know what happened on November the 20th, 1930? The dark of the moon. I see people nodding, putting their hands over their wallets, that kind of thing. The bank crash. Western North Carolina, as we knew it, came to a screeching halt in one day. Depending on the sources you read, somewhere between 8 and 11 banks did not open their doors on that day. And it seemed to me that we are all, as I look around the audience in the room, we're all of us kind of like our money. Anybody despise their money out there? Yeah, we like, oh, there's one person. She's going to contribute all hers. But we're going to pass the hat in a little while. So no, we like our money. We like the security that comes with that. We like the idea that somehow we're safe, that that's a buffer between us and disaster. And on that day, the money went away. It evaporated. There was no insurance, and there was no checkbook, and there was no debit card, and there was no 10 cents on the dollar. It was gone. And so part of what this book is about is the psychology of money. The epigraph is sometimes money costs too much. Ralph Waldo Emerson. The price you pay for your money is too extreme. And so the book began with that idea, and from there it went on to what happened after the crash. The working title for a while, Heather, was The Crash, and then it was After the Crash, and then it was the Sky Club. But the idea being, so how do people respond? In fact, our heroine, Jo Salter, the narrator of the book, says at one point that some of us are fine china, and when we're thrown down, we shatter. And some of us, I'm looking around the room trying to judge who is which. But some of us are like a fine vase, not vase, vase. And when we're thrown down, we shatter. Some of us, according to Jo, are like an old wooden spoon carved out of hickory or ash. No knots. And when we're thrown down, we bounce. And in fact, some of us are made to bounce. And so part of what this book is about is life after the crash. And in the case of our heroine, our narrator, she discovers a lot about her life after the crash at the Sky Club. And one of our audience members lived at the Sky Club in a more recent iteration, not 1930.
No, 2010 to 2015.
There you go. Some 100 years later, essentially. So yeah, so the Sky Club is up on the side of Bowcatcher Mountain. It's there still. The picture on the cover of the book is a contemporary picture taken with a drone by my son, Jesse Roberts. He's seated right over there. And so the Sky Club still sits there on the side of the mountain, echoing with its ghosts. And of course, the ghosts include people like Robert Mitchum. And in this world, Jo Salter. So there's the story.
I love how you talked about that era of the 30s, I really think it was a time when there wasn't a safety net like we have now.
Mhm.
And that really is one of the more fascinating things about that era in history. Not just there was no FDIC insurance, but that, you know, there wasn't really anyone watching out for corrupt politicians, law enforcement, bankers. People were more or less on their own without, and your heroine, Jo Salter, she's walking without a net. And it's one of the most resilient heroines I've ever encountered in fiction. I love her. She's independent. She came from nothing really, and yet because she has this natural gift, she reminded me actually of the Queen's Gambit. You all have seen that show. She's a young woman who comes from nothing but has this natural gift that allows her to carve out a path.
Yeah.
And I'm dying to know how she came into your head, how you invented her.
So I knew I wanted to write about the crash, and I knew I wanted to write about it from the inside out. There's a lot of accounts of the bank closures right here in Asheville, but they're almost all written from the outside in. I'm looking at Jim and Ann Stokely over there. His mom, Wilma Dykeman, has wrote about when the family lost its money in the bank crash on November the 20th. But we're standing, and from that perspective, we're standing on the sidewalk in Pack Square, peering in the window of the bank, pounding on the door. And I wanted to write this story from the inside out. I wanted to be someone on the inside looking out through that window at the people on that sidewalk who had just lost their life savings. And so I needed somebody who would be able to carry a pretty heavy narrative load, if that makes any sense. This narrator had to be somebody who not only was on the inside looking out, but understood what was happening, could feel it coming, could feel the creeping monster coming down the street called the Great Depression. And so I thought this person, didn't have a gender yet, needed to be a math savant, needed to be somebody who saw the world in number, not words, who thinks in numbers, not words. And at that point, it hit me that this it'd be a wonderful thing, because even to this day, 2022, we still think of mathematics and science somewhat as the domain of boys and men. I thought this needed to be a girl, a woman. And she is a woman. She's 26 when the novel begins. And so all of a sudden, it occurred to me that this would be a wonderful opportunity to be a woman for 2 years. Take that any way you want to. To live inside the mind of a woman, and in some ways inside the body of a woman. And so I perked up and I said to Lynn, I said, I'm going to write this whole darn thing in the voice of a woman. And she said, good luck with that. And let's just say there was not a sudden flash of enthusiasm for that idea. But game on, right? Game on. And so I began to think about Jo, and I began to think how interesting it would be if she came into town, like a lot of characters in Appalachian fiction, John Ely's fiction, for example, if she came into town from the deep country and made her way there, and made a life there. And so Josephine Salter was born, in a sense. She goes by Josie in the Big Pine Valley in Madison County. If you know where Big Pine is, you can feel free to shout out at any time. When she comes to town, her cousin tells her Josie sounds like a cow, and she's going to have to change. And so she changes her name to Jo, and she's Jo from there on.
So he pulled it off, the writing of the woman thing. I mean, everything from, feminine hygiene products to reproduction to clothing. you believe every second that you're in the head of a young woman, and a young woman from the 1930s, which is like an additional layer of challenge. So what did you have to do that? Like, did you put a wig on? Like, what did you do?
It was hard sitting in that dress. No, I didn't dress up, I swear. And if you pay Lynn, she'll tell you whether it did or not. No, I didn't, I don't think, except in my imagination. There were a couple of things there. One, many of us know Robert Morgan's work and remember, he used to get asked that question 100,000 times because he wrote so well about women from the inside out. For me, there were two things I think that fed this. One, I knew everything, even though I was not born until this past century, about the place and time. I felt like I had that code. I knew what those cornrows looked like on Big Pine. I knew what that privy smelled like behind the rock house on Big Pine. I had that piece, and I had probably what the town was like, and then it would be an exaggeration to call it a city. So the stage setting felt real already in my imagination. The second thing, there's a photograph. We should have brought it and cast it up on the ceiling or the wall, taken when I was a toddler, maybe 3-4 years old, wearing my little cowboy shirt, taken with my mother, my sister, and my grandmother. And I'm jammed like this in between my sister, who's watching, hey, Judy, virtually, and my grandmother, who was born in 1889. Now think about that. 1889. And so I grew up listening to women's voices, women's stories, women's tales, women's hair. Their hair didn't talk, but you get the general idea. Watching my mother get dressed and getting ready, to go out for the evening. And so I think part of what helped make this book, kind of the recipe for this book, is that idea of if you spent your formative years listening to women talk, and that's 3 generations. That's a lot of woman's experience in there. Then what that does is give you a voice in a way. And for me, the voice was always the key.
That's great. So yeah, you are familiar with all of these, with the geography and the topography. You're one of those rarely sighted creatures in Asheville, a native Western North Carolinian. So I'm just curious, how much did you have to research, or how much did you want to research? Not just about, one of the fun things about reading this book, if you're from Asheville, is seeing mentions of places that are familiar, Charlotte Street, the bank building up on Pack Square, I think Biltmore Park is in it as a new development. So you're kind of doing the map in your head, and it's like a fun little scavenger hunt. But how much did you research, and how much did you just make up? Yeah, the bank. What happened to Central Bank and Trust, which is right downtown on Pack Square? You can get chocolate there now. What is the Chocolate Lounge? Or some of you are nodding lustfully about that. That's the building that Central Bank and Trust was in, the legal building, it says on the outside. It's also the building where Gallatin Roberts committed suicide. So there's a lot in the novel that happens in that building. But for me, a big piece of it was what were the city fathers, and yes, they were fathers primarily, doing in the late 20s that led to the crash, and also what was going on inside that bank. And I'm like probably most of us, I'm not a banker. I know zilch about banking, but one of the things I learned really quickly is the bank doesn't exist for you. Right? The bank has one sole purpose, and it is all together now to make money. Okay. And they call it bank and trust
right? To fool you. Okay, so into thinking that they're up there very carefully petting your money and taking care of it. Well, what they're doing is reinvesting your money at a much higher interest rate than they're paying you for it. And that's how they make money. So at any rate, it was in some ways a kind of shock to me to delve more deeply into that and to realize that not only was that going on, but the whole real estate boom of the 1920s was going on. And if we had all been here in the 1920s, I dare say 3/4 of us would have been furiously buying and selling and trading real estate. Everybody was doing it because they thought they could get rich. And very few of us can say, no, not today, thank you. I'd really rather not be rich. You know, we'd fall for that. And so everybody was vulnerable. And the city at that point was trying to annex as much property as they could, not country property, because there's no profit in it. They were trying to annex Biltmore Forest and Kenilworth and Lakeview Park. They were trying to annex the parts of Buncombe County that would turn over a tax dollar. And so the stage is set for disaster. And there are a number of people in the audience. Wayne Caldwell is sitting back there who knows this as well as anyone. It took us till the 1970s to recover from the decisions that were made in the 1930s. Yeah, the banking that took a lot of research. So.
Yeah, what struck me when I was reading about the people in the bank before the crash, first of all, there's this overarching feeling of the Titanic with the band playing, and everybody's in complete denial. And then at the bank, you know, Joe can do math, but a lot of the people in the bank aren't really bothered with the math. They're just going with the flow, making the profits. Nobody really knows what the numbers are saying. And she's the only one who sees it coming down the pike.
Yeah. Yeah, and that, by the way, I don't know, that the women in the audience who read it can vote later and say, this is, I think, a feminist book in the sense that it's about a woman living in a very paternalistic world. And in fact, she's the assistant to the head cashier. She can't be the head cashier because she's a woman. And in fact, from the drop, when she's going through training on day 1 and day 2 of her life at the bank, an older woman who is her mentor tells her, look, honey, they're always going to pay you less and you're always going to know more. Just get used to it, you know. And she goes on to say that, and she says, well, how do you get away with it? She said, I trained these cocksuckers. It's in the books, I had to say. And the editors at Turner had fun with that. They decided that was one word, not two, just in case you've always wondered. Okay.
Yeah, that's good to know. Yeah. So she is a feminist and very independent, but she also has a pretty sexy love interest in the book. Would you like to talk about Levi and how you arrived at his character?
So, spoiler alert, y'all, if you haven't gotten to Levi yet, you will. I hope you stay around long enough. So Levi Airwood is the very mysterious, dark and violent and mysterious manager of the Sky Club, which is short for irresistible, right? Joe even says at one point, what woman could resist all that? And I think that there's some truth in that. So but she doesn't know who he is. Nobody knows who he is. He never speaks, right? He just hits people over the head and things like that. And so Levi she's very drawn to Levi when she first starts to go to the Sky Club. And at one point, she finally sort of tracks him down into his lair because he has this ability to kind of appear and disappear like a ghost almost within the club itself. And he, in some sense, he's the spirit of the club, I suppose you'd say. And she finally tracks him down. And even then, she's having this very one-sided conversation with him. And and nobody knows his name. He's Airwood. He's the mysterious Airwood. He doesn't have a first name. And she finally gets him to speak. And when he does, she realizes that she's found a compatriot. She's found somebody else who talks like she does. She's found somebody else not from Big Pine, but from Spring Creek. She's found somebody else who speaks the language the way it was intended to be spoken, not the way they speak it uptown at the club. And it's at that moment when a switch flips in a way. And from there, they develop a very complicated relationship. And so a lot of the last half of the book, in addition to the Sky Club and bootlegging and breaking the law and lots of other things, the last half of the book has a lot to do with the two of them in relationship to each other, because there's a I don't even know what to call it. What would you call it? You're a writer. A tennis match or something going on between the two of them. They keep hitting that ball back and forth across the net. In fact, there's one chapter where she says, I don't know how to say who I am in relation to him. Right? He's not my boyfriend. He's a bootlegger. I'm 27 at that point. I'm not his girlfriend. What am I? She eventually sort of settles on lover. That's one of the nice words she settles on. She likes words. She settles on some bad words. She settles on some words that your mother never wanted you to hear. But anyway.
Well, speaking of words, would you like to read chapter 42?
I've been told I can't read chapter 42.
Oh,
it has a
not gonna let
dictionary.
you read
That the audience is not old enough to hear chapter 42. In fact, when you get to chapter 42, just skip it. How about that? But
perhaps something else.
Something else. I'm gonna give y'all a choice. You get to pick. Do you want to hear a fight in a nightclub, or the last day of the bank? Fight. I'm glad to hear you say that. And some of you are thinking, oh, well, that bank would be very interesting because, but it's in there. Trust me, the last day. Chapter 34 is the November 20th, 1930, the dark of the moon, one of the coldest days yet in that dying year. And that's the last day of Central Bank and Trust. This is slightly earlier in the book. This is when Joe has been going now to the Sky Club fairly regularly with her cousin Sissy and her cousin's boyfriend, Benjamin, who's not quite mature enough to know who he is. This is, if you're keeping score at home, starts on page 166 if you're interested. And this is she's got a thing for Airwood, but she doesn't quite yet know who he is. And so, and you'll just have to imagine this in your living room.
I know exactly where.
Oh, okay, you know what this is. The joint that night was alive. Oops, I'm supposed to. We're competing with ZZ Top tonight at the auditorium. So just imagine the beard, that'll help. The joint that night was alive. The whole band was up front, the bass, the trombone, the blaring trumpet, and the young black man at the piano making the notes ring out. They were all dressed alike, black suit, white shirts, clothes like their skin, black, white, black, white, black. We couldn't even get close to the dance floor. At first, we all three sat at the bar waiting for a table to open. Sissy and Ben had turned around on their bar stools, sipping martinis and watching the action. I nursed my brandy and talked to Mac whenever he stopped mixing drinks long enough to even glance my way. At one point, I noticed a big stick leaning in the corner behind the bar. When I asked Mac what it was, he only said, Louisville Slugger, Joe, 32 inches. I like the number. Playing baseball tonight, Mac? He shook his head. It's Peacemaker for when things get really rough. I like to have it handy of a Saturday night. Mac's been hitting the throat a lot, so I'm trying to. I smiled at him. I could feel the brandy burning in my cheeks, and I was happy as I knew how to be. Right then, right there. The bass and the trombone were pushing some sound. I spun on my stool to look around. The piano man was lighting another cigarette from the first cigarette. The trumpet was mopping his face with a towel which he tossed on top of the piano. I could see Levi Airwood standing behind the piano with an unlit cigar clenched in that sharp jaw of his. Light the damn match, Levi, I thought. Join the fun. But as dark as it was beyond the piano, I could see he was watching something. I tracked his eyes past the band to a table. 4 guys and 2 gals seated smack beside the dance floor. The men were wearing expensive clothes, but looked hard. The women looked soft in the head, hard in the body. Their stockings were rolled provocatively down below the knee, which sent a message. There was little food on the table and a lot of liquor. The women were smoking and sipping something sweet. The men were just drinking. At that moment, the trumpet joined and the piano followed him into the fray. I slipped off my bar stool and set my glass on the bar. I knew Mac would keep it for me. My hips were already moving. I turned and pulled Sissy's Ben off his stool. Come on, little brother. I can't sit still. Sissy nodded and I dragged Benjamin Scott out onto the floor. Who knows exactly what they were playing other than their hearts? But I was doing that strong black bottom and Ben kept up as best he could. Black and silver. That's all you know and all you need to know about that number. My dress was reflecting the nighttime light of the sun, and Ben was grinning and mostly watching. People were laughing and the room was spinning. The river of my dress runs into the sea, flowing in the silver moonlight. My God says they play jazz in heaven. And on earth, right up until Ben and I bumped into another couple and the woman fell down. We grinned and gasped a little bit and said we were sorry. Ben tried to help her up, but she'd broken a strap on her shoe and couldn't quite make it. The man pushed Ben harder than he needed to. It was only then I realized they were from the table Levi had been watching. Tough guys and hard gals. Keep your hands off her, Junior, the guy said, before your pansy ass gets hurt. He was older than any of us, 50 maybe. Excuse me, sir, said Sissy's Ben. I was only trying to be of assistance. Laughter from the table where the rest of them were sitting. Say it again, pretty boy, from the other woman. The place got quiet. Even the band fell silent, which seldom ever happened. I offered my apologies, sir, Ben began again, but the old guy cut him off. You apologizing for being a fairy or your girlfriend being a slut? In all my years of fighting with my brothers, I don't think I'd ever been called a slut. Not to my face. I stepped in closer beside Ben, who was stammering. Buster, I said low and quiet, straight at the man's ill-shaven face. It was your pinhead girlfriend ran into us. I think you ought to apologize for her. You could tell he didn't like that. The people at his table were laughing at him. He turned to stare me down. Where are you from, sister? That was about all he could manage. Sounds like someplace to hell and gone out in the boondocks. I could feel Mac and Levi closing in. Mac on the other side of Ben and Levi on the other side of their table, where no one had really noticed him yet. Where I'm from, the men don't act like you, I said. I reached slowly over and pushed Ben back a step or two. I figured I'd gotten him into this, and Sissy'd never forgive me if something happened to him. There was sweat in my eyes and trickling down the hollow of my back. It's time to ease it on down, Mr. Jameson. This was Levi. Somehow he'd slipped all the way around the table and was standing beside me. I could tell he was trying to get between me and the old guy. The boy apologized. Your girlfriend's okay. Everybody just needs to relax. Shut up, Airwood. I'm having a conversation with her, the country slut. You shouldn't say that, Mr. Jameson. I'll have to ask you and your friends to leave. I'm not ashamed of where I'm from, I said. You ought to be. The old guy was looking straight at me with sagging, bloodshot eyes. Levi let go of my arm and hit the old man so hard on the nose that his face exploded. He went down like a hog who'd been hit in the head with a sledgehammer. The other 3 men at the table were up now. One hefted his chair as if he meant to use it, and Max stepped in that direction, showed him the Louisville Slugger. Don't, Max said to him. It wouldn't be any fun. Everything was still except for the old guy groaning on the floor. The seconds stretched out. The dust motes floated quietly in the air. Finally, the guy with the chair slammed it back down on the floor, showing us how tough he was, even though he had no intention of mixing it up with Mac. Levi nodded. Thank you, he said to the chair guy. Smart move. I'll help you and your friends get Mr. Jameson out to your car. I have a feeling he'd appreciate it if you stopped by a doctor's office on the way home. His nose is broken. Go to hell, Airwood. I could tell out of the corner of my eye that Levi was smiling. Sure, he said. Why not? But first, let's get the district attorney out to the parking lot. He's bleeding all over the dance floor.
There's no shortage of awesome action scenes in this book. Lots of great peril. I guess one would expect that with bootlegging. What I love about it is, you talked about how Joe started off before the crash working in this sort of patriarchy at the bank. And then the crash comes, the bank closes, and she makes the transition to working at the Sky Club. And it's a whole different world, and where she's more of a partner. And honestly, like it's like her family at the Sky Club. It kind of feels like. So that's a pretty cool transition. Yeah.
She is a partner by the end. And again, spoiler alert. It's 50-50 by the end.
Mm-hmm.
Being able to add and subtract is a pretty good quality to have. I don't know if any of you also possess that skill, but yeah, if you're going into business, it's good to have somebody who can balance the books.
Yeah, it's true. Should we take some questions, do you think? Or
yes.
I don't really have a question. I'd just like to say that I thought chapter 19 about the Lexington Avenue market deserved a Pulitzer Prize.
Well, thank you. And I agree. Thank you. Chapter, I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember this, and you've been here long enough to remember this. Some of you are, I know, as I look out in the audience. Yeah, Lexington Avenue used to be a great place to get stabbed or shot or otherwise hospitalized. And it was the original farmers market, but it was before the farmers market had been sanitized. People came into town and there was a lot of bartering that went on. And this, of course, this is 1930 when Joe's describing it. And it was a little bit of country in the city. And so when her head gets kind of whopper jawed, do you know what whopper jawed is? Sideways, crooked. She would go down to Lexington, put on her old dress, and she'd go down to Lexington Avenue, and she'd hear the King's English spoke the way it was intended. And she would also hear good country people, Flannery O'Connor would say, although Flannery would make fun of them, and I didn't. And she'd hear music the way it was meant to be played. The country, again, mountain music. She loves music of all kinds. She's a dead set lover of jazz, but she also loves the old ways as well. And so, I think Lexington Avenue. And when some of us were kids, Debbie Austin raised her hand, and she didn't you used to work on Lexington? No, I'm kidding. That's a joke. But yeah, some of us are old enough to remember when Lexington Avenue was just kind of a running,
on Saturdays, farmers would bring their produce in wagons pulled by mules. This was in the 50s. And Jackson's trading post was across the street from the market. And there was, a place for you to tie up your horse.
Mhm.
Because people came on horseback to pick up leather work that was being done at Jackson's, or the trade, the horse trading going on Lexington.
Oh, yeah. And sometimes not just horses were being traded.
I think you could probably have gotten anything you wanted. on
Yeah,
Lexington
and I was
Avenue.
looking for the pair. It says you could get a shotgun repaired on Lexington, or a wagon wheel. You could buy a dose of liquor or a dose of clap in the form of a downer like City Gal. It had a perfectly horrible reputation uptown in the world that the Scotts and the Morgans traveled in, and I loved it.
And there's a great character, I forget his name, but the man from home who she sees at the Lexington market, who's kind of her connection to home and keeps her grounded and in what the country folk are doing and thinking during the Depression.
Pink Starnes is based on a historical model. Pinckney Starnes was one of the founders of the Imperial Life Insurance Company, right there on the corner of, Wayne will have to help me, it's Lexington, no, what is it? Lexington and College. So, and he was another, countryman who came to town and made his way in the world. So,
Yeah, didn't he say that the two things people will always need are life insurance and liquor?
yeah. In the worst of times, if you're selling either life insurance or liquor, you're in business, but otherwise, don't count on it. So, what else? Yeah, Jennifer.
Terry, you have become a master of brevity in your lifestyle. Is it Ben Franklin? He said, give me 1 hour, I'll write you a 3-page letter. Give me 3 hours, I'll write you a 1-page letter.
Mhm.
Is that Ben Franklin?
Yeah.
Saying something meaningful succinctly is a challenge. And this entire book is made up of sections where sometimes it's 3 paragraphs that make up an entire section. Sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's 1. But it's not disjointed. They flow. One section to another, each very brief. And it's like a dance. Step change, very quick changes. And it occurred to me, I had a chance to read and finish, thank you, the entire book.
Mhm.
And it occurred to me the entire time I was reading it, the writing style in this book is jazz.
Yeah.
And I'm from New Orleans, so I get to say.
Absolutely. You're the expert. Yeah.
So my question, were you aware that you were doing
Eventually, is I think probably my most honest answer. I don't know that I was in the beginning. And part of that was letting Joe talk, just letting Joe be Joe, and getting gracefully out of the way and letting Joe do her thing. And I think that and those of you who are writers in the room, and there are some excellent writers in the room, know this from experience, eventually you figure out what you're doing. And in some cases, the characters tell you what they are doing. So I first of all, thank you. I'm gonna write that down before I go home tonight. What Jennifer said, but also Joe has that, right? I mean, Joe's. She very quickly picks up dances, and what you all need to do is go home tonight and Google the Charleston and the turkey trot and the black bottom, and come back when you've mastered it. You may need to bring your orthopedist with you when you master those dances. But Joe's right there. She can't sit still. And I think the same thing is true in a sense linguistically. This is her voice. She's profane. She's very early in the novel. She and Sissy put their heads together and figure out about contraception, and that's historically accurate, by the way, those of you who would like to know. And there's a way in which what that allows them to do is sort of begin to take charge of their own lives in a way that is timely given the Supreme Court of the United States. Enough said about that. Yeah, Wayne.
Terry, you and John Ely were friends.
Mhm.
And I saw a lot of John Ely in the book. Would you like to comment on that?
I would love to. Thank you for asking that. Wayne, I don't know that. By the way, for those of you who don't know Wayne Caldwell, he's a wonderful writer. I'm going to use a Josh Goforth line. I've been waiting to use it all night. He'd say, if you don't know who Wayne Caldwell is, you need to look it up on your rubbing phone. And Josh is from Madison County, so that is apropos. John Ely, who's great writer. He's one of our, he was same generation as Wilma Dykeman. He wrote a book called Last One Home, late in life. Wayne picked this out immediately. This is like their first cousins, I think, Last One Home in this book. And there's a man named Pink Wright who was John's grandfather, great grandfather. I'm not sure, but and Pink, yeah, there you go, Pink Wright. There's Jarita Wright over there, who I just went ahead and used his real name, Pink Starnes, in this novel. But I think John had this gift, and this is related, I think, in part to what Jennifer was saying as well. John had this gift of writing dialogue that just sang, right? I mean, you could read a page of John's, because he was trained as a dramatist, for one thing, so he had that on the rest of us, but he could write a page of dialogue. And in the talking, these people would just come alive. You could hear them, you could see them, you could hear their voices. And in a way that I know Heather appreciates, Wayne appreciates, it's hard to do. That's hard to do, right? It's hard to write dialogue that is dramatic in the sense that it moves you as you're reading it. And so I was aware of that. I was conscious of the fact that this novel was maybe first cousins with Last One Home. And of course, where we're from, that means you can get married. Not really. That's a joke, by the way. But for those of you who are thinking, really? No. I had all those options. No. Thank you. Stephanie's saying a question from the world.
Yes, question from the virtual world. Actually, I have several from the virtual world. We'll start with Robin. I'll go ahead and make a blanket statement that most people are also typing in how much they love the book. So I won't read that every time. Just take it as a given. They love the book. So Robin is mentioning how strong a character Sissy is, and how much she enjoyed Sissy, but seems to feel like there's not enough Sissy in the book. It just asks, if there was something missed, or if maybe there would be a sequel.
Oh, Sissy's story. I can hear. Yeah. No, Sissy's just fun because she is who she is. There's nothing about Sissy that is not Sissy. From the first thing she says to, I'll see if I can find it. She says to Joe, "You've got a boy's body. Well, with you, don't take it wrong. I have a body like a cow. Bovine. I would smoke 2 packs a day and starve myself silly, and I still wouldn't be as skinny as you." And then she goes on to talk about her mammaries. Okay. And so Sissy gets a lot of play out of her mammaries. She almost snags the second son of the second richest family in Western North Carolina, and makes no bones about it. I mean, Sissy's on the move. And you gotta love to know Sissy is to love her, truly. So maybe there is a sequel.
Well, Robin would appreciate it.
Okay. Lynn was nodding too. Lynn's a Sissy advocate. Yeah.
I'd like to go ahead and ask one more question from the audience before we go from the virtual audience before we go back to the in-house audience, because we do have a bunch of questions. We may just not be able to get to everything, but that's how it goes with popular events. So I And Elizabeth is asking you to talk about the primary sources that you looked at when you were researching the book, and a little bit about how those sources have affected your sense of Asheville. The question I want to combine that with is about your fascination with the period. Tom is asking you to talk about your ongoing fascination with the period between the end of the Civil War and 1930. So those two things seem to be a little bit connected. If you want to talk about researching those periods and why you keep going back to those periods and what comes out of your sense of art.
Yeah. So two questions from great writers. The primary sources, I took a long, hard look at Gallatin Roberts' life, and there is in the Pack Library, in the historical collection downstairs, are his papers and artifacts from his life, including his suicide note, and including his sort of day book, I think he called it, is like a journal, where in the days leading up to November the 20th, he's writing day by day what he sees coming. And he knows what it means. He knows it means the end of Asheville. And so there are prime, and he's in the bullseye, right? He's standing right in the middle of this storm that's coming. So in a sense, that primary research gave a sort of emotional heft to this. That maybe it wouldn't have had otherwise, because that language of despair and fear is powerful, when it's real. I mean, you can smell it almost. So I would say that in response to Elizabeth's question. And I think what that helped color my imagination. The other thing is that Asheville in the 1920s was in love with itself, right? I mean, it had a fatal self-obsession. Everybody was getting rich and they were feeding off the tourist industries. That sounds familiar. And the whole idea was, and there was also, I would throw in, Asheville had its own royalty. Jennifer said this to me at one point, that what was different about Asheville in the 20s is we had the Vanderbilts, right? We had our own queen and our own duchy, I guess. I don't know how you say it. And we had Biltmore Forest and we had the club. At one point, Pink Starn says to Joe, when things go bad, and they will, don't go to them club people, because they will plow you under. You come to me, meaning to another country person, And so all of that, I think, is in the prime, if you read the newspapers from the time period and you read sort of even local history once removed, you begin to get a feeling for a train traveling really fast and the bridge is out, right? And it's coming. And some people were smart enough to know it was coming, and some people were so in love with the feeling of speed, the roaring 20s, that they couldn't stop long enough to imagine that it was coming. One more thing, my love affair with the 1920s, I don't know what that's about. I can't get out of there. Every time I think, screw that. I'm going to write a book set in, fill in the date, 1976, when I was actually, most of us, all of us were alive. I think about it and I think about it and I just can't, in part because the 20s, it feels to me, have so many parallels to the 2020s. The great flu pandemic of 1918, sound familiar? Followed by the Great Depression, God forbid, followed by a world war, right? The other thing about the 20s is that comes out in the novel, and Heather and I've talked about this, is that the 1920s was a time when women came into their own. So many men had gone off to fight in World War I and either never came back or came back crippled, that women went to work and smoked cigarettes and wore pants and cut their hair, you know. Yeah, so all of that, I think that you're able to speak to our current reality through an oblique lens, perhaps.
Speaking of current reality, may I dare to ask how you see the difference or the similarity between what they were doing then and what we are doing now?
I think, it's a great question. I think that Asheville has a split personality at the very least. It has, it's drunk on money, you know, a lot of it real estate money. The passage that Daniel quoted in Mountain Express, where Joe compares land in the country to land in the city, and she says land in the country is your lover. That may be a rough lover, a hard-handed lover, but it's your lover. And land in the city is a whore, bought and sold. And I think Asheville is, in a lot of ways, is drunk on money, and it's drunk on outside money. And it's forgotten in some ways who it is, what it was, what it is, in the sense that, now again, it's still there. Those country people, where are you, Mary Caldwell? I see you hiding back there. Those country people from Canada, you know, are still here, but increasingly there's a sense, and I like Asheville, don't get me wrong, don't take this the wrong way. We chose to live here, but there's still a big difference between the reality, the culture of Asheville and the reality and the culture of Clyde, Murphy, or Marshall, you know, or Hot Springs. Hot Springs is, somebody asked me once, said, what do they think of you in New York? And I said, well, I don't know, but they love me in Hot Springs. And I'll take that, you know.
Just to step back inside the Sky Club for a moment. There's a wonderful archive at UNC on the Sky Club, and you find it under the names Gus and Emma Adler, who were the actual proprietors of the original club, which I think was called the Heidelberg.
It was called the Heidelberg right up until World War II.
Yes.
And then the anti-German sentiment caused them to rethink the name.
So what was your connection to this building up on Bowcatcher Mountain that made you want to set? Because you could have had a speakeasy anywhere in town, but
I think I didn't have a personal connection other than the fact that I'd known it was there. My friend Valerie went there, she says, and Jarita shut the place down probably. But anyway, no, I'd never been in the building until Lynn and I were invited just to take a quick tour not that long ago. But I wanted something to balance with the bank. You know, the bank is one of those hard, heavy, cold realities. You drove here in a car, not you personally, although you might have. Probably most of us drove here in a car that cost more than the annual salary of a well-educated, somebody with a good job in 1930. And right? I mean, we have money, for better or worse, curse and a blessing. Sometimes, money costs too much, but we have it. And so all I'm really saying is that the bank, to me, always had this heavy quality, like this is real, numbers are real, money matters. That's what is the backbone of our existence. And what I really needed was something to balance with that, right? And the Sky Club is in the sky.
well, I have to say, you did a fabulous job representing what you knew about the Sky Club, because having lived there and having researched and having, books about what went on in the club, and pictures of Grace Kelly sitting on the terrace, and Robert Mitchum and Thunder Road being filmed in the bar there, the bar scene in Thunder Road. You perfectly captured the feel and the vibe that was going on, I think, eventually at that time, because it was 10 years later.
And yeah, it was, because
started.
it went at the time of the book, the Sky Club was still a private residence. So that's, fiction. That's that made up stuff, but the other thing I would say is, to me, they're both real. Those are both realities. Money really does matter to just about all of us, and having it beats not having. On the other hand, that's not all there is. There's music. So
There's a trap door to the basement where they took the hooch. I know what it is.
we need to have a field trip, obviously, but yeah.
So I know we could go on for a while, but we are at the top of the hour and we need some time for Terry to sign books. So I just want to say thank you, Terry and Heather, again, for a lovely conversation, and invite you all to provide any final words before we wrap up for this evening.
I'm just so excited about this book, and I'm going to run over there and buy my copy before any of you, if I can, because I'm afraid it might sell out. But I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. And Terry, thanks for writing it.
You're very welcome. A couple of thanks. One, I want to say thanks to Heather. This has been a really lovely experience. And her new book, The Puppeteer's Daughters, it was feted last night in this very same place. So please take a look at that. And how much fun, right? How much fun can you have talking about books? And I also want to say thanks to all of you for being here. We live in very strange times, and some of our friends who aren't here, tested positive in the last few days or weeks, and so couldn't be with us. But we're here. We're here now, and I hope any and all of you will let us know what you think about the book. It really was a joy to write. I will say that. Joe Salter, if you're going to spend 2 years with somebody in quarantine other than Lynn, Joe Salter is not a bad person to spend time with. She's salty. So thank you for being here. And thanks to Malaprop.
Thanks to Malaprop.